I had a job to do. I was under pressure. Many times they called down and said, how long are you going to be? How long are you going to be? How long are you going to be? But we couldn't rush it. We had to take our time.
Something strange happens whenever the JFK case comes up. People argue about bullets, angles, shadows and frames, but the one thing almost nobody talks about is the man who actually handled the president's body. A man who saw the wounds before the photographs, before the edits, before the official story hardened into stone. His name was Paul O'Connor Robinson, and the more you learn about him, the harder it becomes to trust anything we thought we knew. Because the silence around him wasn't natural. It grew piece by piece, as if the story worked better without him in it. Doctors were quoted, agents were quoted, photographers were quoted. But the man standing inches from the most important autopsy in American history, he just faded into the background, like someone had quietly nudged him out of the frame. But why? Let's find out. You know how some people move through the world without noise or spotlight, but everything about them says they're steady, reliable and built for hard situations? That was Tom Robinson. Before his name got pulled into the most argued moment in American history, he was simply the man families trusted when they had to say goodbye to someone they loved. He was just good at what he did, almost too good, as it would turn out. Robinson started out like thousands of young men in the post-war years, looking for a trade that mattered. Mortuary work wasn't glamorous, but it demanded discipline and care. Restorative arts, repairing damaged features, rebuilding what violence took away, making a human being look like themselves again, was still a developing field back then. Embalmers didn't have the tools or materials we have today. Every repair was done by hand, with skill built through repetition, not technology. The job asked for a calm mind and a willingness to face things most people would turn away from. Robinson excelled at that. Colleagues remembered him as the guy who stepped in when a case was too complicated for others. He worked in a time when car crashes, factory injuries, and war-related traumas still showed up on embalming tables with regularity. Restorative work meant more than cosmetics, it meant solving problems. A jagged wound, a crushed cheekbone, a missing portion of the scalp. He had to rebuild what was gone, know how tissue behaved after death, and predict how every repair would settle under lighting during a viewing. His decisions shaped the final memory a family carried. November 22nd, 1963 was chaos for everyone watching the news. For Robinson, it began as a regular work day. There was no hint that he'd soon be handling the body of the President of the United States. By the time the call came from Bethesda Naval Hospital, the entire country had already seen breaking bulletins, and reporters were trying to make sense of a timeline no one understood yet. Robinson didn't get those hours to process anything. The job came at him instantly. He wasn't chosen because he was politically connected. He wasn't even chosen because of rank or seniority. He was chosen because the staff at Bethesda knew he was the one person who could handle the level of damage they'd just finished examining. The Kennedy family didn't want a public viewing, but they wanted a private moment with someone they loved. That meant the body had to look peaceful again, and that meant the person working on it needed experience far beyond what most embalmers had. What Robinson didn't know was that the details he noticed that night, the exact position of the wounds, the shape of the damage, and the repairs he had to make would clash so strongly with the official reports that his very presence would later become inconvenient. The Warren Commission would eventually publish 888 pages about the assassination, but somehow they didn't include Robinson's name even once. The man who handled the body, inspected every wound directly, and repaired the visible damage was written out of the story entirely. And this is where the tension starts to build. Everything about Robinson's life shows a man with no motive to lie. Nothing about him suggests exaggeration or attention-seeking. Yet his professional observations made hours after the assassination don't match the government's final story. His testimony, when he finally gave it 15 years later, clashed with the diagrams used to argue that a lone gunman fired from behind. His notes contradicted key claims about wound placement. His memory was consistent, even decades later. So when the world eventually discovered that the Warren Commission left him out completely, one question became inescapable. If Tom Robinson's testimony aligned with the physical wounds on the body, why wasn't he allowed to speak? By the time Robinson arrived at Bethesda Naval Hospital, the autopsy was finished, but the air in the room still carried that frozen weight you only feel after something traumatic has unfolded. Staff members were moving slowly, quietly, almost mechanically, as if no one knew what to say out loud. The smell of surgical disinfectant still clung to everything. Tables, instruments, sheets, everything looked like the ending of a long, desperate attempt to understand what had happened in Dallas. Robinson didn't need anyone to brief him. His work always began with observation, and what he saw when he approached the body told him everything he needed to know. The president had suffered violent trauma to the head. There were incisions from surgical procedures, cuts made during the autopsy, and the usual emergency marks from Parkland Hospital. But the defining feature, the one thing impossible to ignore, was the massive defect at the lower right rear of the skull. He had worked on countless gunshot victims over the years, and he knew the difference between an entrance wound and an exit wound. Entrance wounds were small and clean. Exit wounds were not. This one was a blowout. Rough, wide, and missing bone. The type of wound that instantly tells an embalmer how much work will be needed just to make a face presentable to a grieving family. This was the wound he would spend the most time repairing. What struck him wasn't speculation about ballistics. It was the obvious physical reality right in front of him. The blowout wasn't above the ear, where later official drawings would place it. It was lower, toward the back. It was the kind of defect that would be impossible to confuse with anything else if you were standing over the body. Then there was the smaller wound at the hairline, the one near the right temple. It wasn't the type of wound the public ever learned about, but it mattered to Robinson because embalming fluid can leak through small openings if they aren't sealed. He had to plug it with wax so the fluid wouldn't escape during the preparation process. That meant he handled the wound directly, pressed into it, observed its shape and knew its size. Later, when he testified under oath, he called it a likely entry wound. Not because he was theorizing about shooters or motives, but because morticians worked with entry wounds all the time. The characteristics were familiar. The placement matched what he saw with his own hands. Then came the back wound. The Warren Commission would later place the entry point high at the base of the neck to support the single bullet theory. But Robinson didn't repair a wound there. The wound he treated was almost 6 inches lower. It aligned with the location reported in the original autopsy notes and with the hole in Kennedy's jacket. It did not align with the diagram published later to support a lone gunman. He remembered the skull fracture lines radiating from the blowout, the missing section of bone, and the way the tissue reacted under his tools. He remembered the bruising patterns. He remembered the drainage from the throat wound, which suggested it was an exit point, not an entry. All these details were routine to him, but they carried implications far beyond his profession. Restorative work in the early 1960s wasn't as advanced as it is today. There were no computerized tools, no advanced fillers, no digital visual references. Everything came down to skill, steady hands, and a kind of craftsmanship most people never think about. Robinson had been trained in this world long before November 1963, and the people who hired him always trusted that he worked with accuracy, not guesswork. That mattered tonight more than ever. His work almost always started with observation. Before touching anything, he traced the injuries with his eyes, following the shape and direction of each break, each tear, each entrance point. With JFK, those first minutes carried more truth than any later investigation. A massive blowout at the rear of the skull, wide enough that he could see inside the cranial cavity. The bone was missing in places, and what remained had splintered into sharp, irregular edges. He studied the missing portion first. The back of the head needed structural rebuilding to restore shape, because without it, nothing else would hold. He used everything in his toolkit: wax, plaster-like materials, setting powder, flexible adhesives to rebuild the curve of the skull. Restorative artists often describe this step as sculpting more than repairing, and that's exactly what it was. He shaped layer by layer, smoothing the edges, matching the natural slope of the head. He followed the same anatomical lines he'd memorized during training, but the wound forced him to invent solutions as he went. And while he reconstructed that rear defect, he kept noticing how different it was from what later reports would claim. The official diagrams eventually placed the major head wound high on the right side, above the ear. but his hands were working several inches further back, low on the skull, in a spot no official diagram gave serious attention. Once the rear section held its shape, he moved to the forehead. The forehead wound was small, almost surgical in appearance, but clearly not the result of any medical procedure. It sat just inside the hairline, neat and round, the sort of entrance point he'd seen many times on gunshot victims. Morticians in the 1960s dealt with firearm wounds regularly, so he didn't need theories. Next came the lower back wound. Robinson always remembered this one because its location didn't match the placement drawn later in official diagrams. When he saw it, the entry sat low, too low to match the single bullet theory that required it to be higher. The wound aligned with the holes later found in the jacket and shirt. That clothing evidence supported Robinson's memory, not the Warren Commission's diagrams. But again, he wasn't trying to make a political point. He simply needed to treat the wound so nothing leaked, nothing shifted, and nothing drew attention during the viewing. He cleaned the area first. Embalming fluid sometimes escaped from back wounds during preparation, so he sealed it with a mixture strong enough to hold under pressure. Then he applied a thin layer of wax, blending the edges into the surrounding skin. Unlike the head wounds, this repair didn't require heavy reconstruction. It just needed accuracy. The placement had to be exact, the texture consistent, and the colour matching the rest of the torso. Beyond the ballistic injuries were the surgical alterations made during the autopsy. The Y-shaped incision from the chest downward, the skull cut from the craniotomy, and the areas where saws and scalpels had opened the body. These were standard procedures for medical examiners, but they created visual challenges for morticians. Robinson stitched what he could, reinforced tissue where needed, and used mortuary putty to fill gaps left by bone removal. The head reconstruction took the most time, and every moment revealed new details. The skull, fracture pattern, the missing sections of bone, the direction of the blowout, they all suggested a path that didn't mirror the official explanation. What made his perspective different from the doctor's wasn't expertise, it was proximity. The medical team had worked quickly, under pressure, with dozens of military officers and government personnel crowding the room. Robinson worked alone, hours later, quietly, with time to study every inch. Because the night didn't end with the repairs. The moment he stepped out of that room, the pressures, the contradictions, and the silence surrounding his experience began closing in. To understand why Robinson never sat before the Warren Commission, you have to look at how that investigation was built. Most people think the commission began with an open question: what happened in Dallas? But the evidence points to something different. The framework was set early, almost immediately. One shooter, one rifle, one direction. Everything inside the report had to support that outline. Anything that disrupted it was pushed aside, ignored, or replaced with interpretations that kept the structure standing. And Robinson, without meaning to, carried information that threatened those conclusions. There was also a strategic element. The commission leaned heavily on summaries and interpretations provided by select experts, people who could explain wounds in a way that aligned with the existing theory. Morticians, however, don't interpret. They describe what they worked on. There's another layer that often gets overlooked. Oswald died 2 days after JFK. That changed everything. If Oswald had gone to trial, the commission would have needed airtight evidence, including testimony from every professional who touched the body. They would have needed Robinson. But the moment Jack Ruby killed Oswald, there was no courtroom to prepare for, no defense attorney to challenge the trajectory, no chance for the public to see the raw evidence debated. With Oswald gone, the commission's job shifted. Instead of building a case for trial, it moved to building a story for history. In that environment, witnesses who complicated the story became liabilities, and Robinson, through no intention of his own, complicated things more than almost anyone else connected to the body. There's also a political and public relations angle here. The country was in shock. Confidence in government mattered. The White House, the Secret Service, and national intelligence agencies all had stakes in preserving stability. The lone gunman conclusion offered closure. It calmed the country. It simplified a tragedy that was otherwise tangled with Cold War fears. Introducing a mortician, whose observations contradicted the official drawings, would have raised more questions than answers. And questions were the last thing Washington wanted in 1964. A witness with no bias is the hardest witness to challenge. You can question motives, you can question memory, but you can't question a man who rebuilt a skull with his own hands the same night the president died. Years passed before he ever spoke publicly, and when he did, his account didn't sound like someone trying to fuel controversy. It sounded like someone recounting his work exactly as he'd always done it. But once Robinson finally opened up, his testimony challenged the entire architecture of the official story. The moment Robinson walked into the hearing room in 1978, the atmosphere shifted. There was nothing dramatic about him. He looked like someone who'd shown up after years of silence simply because a committee asked him to. And honestly, that grounded energy made his presence hit harder than any expert who'd taken the stand before him. The House Select Committee on Assassinations had already heard from pathologists, FBI agents, and military personnel, who all carried polished resumes and carefully filtered memories. Robinson wasn't that type. When they handed him paper and asked him to show what he saw, he didn't hesitate. He simply drew it. His hand moved the way someone moves when they've repeated the image in their mind for years. His diagrams were plain, uncoloured, almost blunt. And yet, those basic lines instantly caused tension in the hearing room, because they told a story the earlier government narrative had spent years avoiding. The most striking part was how aligned he was with the medical staff from that night. Doctors, nurses, autopsy technicians, and military personnel had all described a large defect to the rear of the head. Robinson matched them without even trying. His testimony connected the dots they'd already drawn. It was the kind of consistency committees usually beg for. But instead of embracing him, the HSCA treated him like a footnote. Still, even with all that sincerity, his words landed like unwanted weight. The committee let him speak, but they kept their distance from the implications. His wound descriptions didn't match the official diagrams presented years earlier. His statements clashed with the clean final version of the autopsy the country had been given, and acknowledging him fully would have meant admitting that key details of the government's original explanation didn't hold up. The strange thing about Robinson's story isn't that people argued with him, it's that almost nobody argued at all. After the hearings, his name didn't pop up in the usual places. Not in documentaries, not in anniversary specials, not in major investigative books. It was as if history quietly turned the page and left him behind. People often assume witnesses get forgotten because they're unreliable, but Robinson's case is the opposite. His consistency made him almost inconvenient. His memory lined up too well with early medical testimonies that didn't match the official version of events. And when a witness fits the puzzle too neatly in the part no one wants to revisit, the simplest solution is to stop mentioning their piece altogether. That's exactly what happened. Journalists rarely cited him, because adding his perspective would force them to address contradictions in the official autopsy narrative. Filmmakers didn't reach out because his version of events required time, detail, and uncomfortable context. Even researchers who dug into deeper controversies sometimes bypassed him, not because they doubted him, but because including him opened more questions than their documentaries had time to answer. And it wasn't just outside voices. Government bodies avoided revisiting his statements completely. His testimony never triggered a new review or a request for clarification. His diagrams weren't cross-checked against the autopsy photos. His alignment with other medical witnesses wasn't treated as a sign that something needed re-examination. It was treated like a loose thread best left alone. Acknowledging him meant reopening the most sensitive part of the case. The exact nature of the head wound, the direction of damage, and the way early descriptions conflicted with the final government explanation. That's the core irony here. He wasn't ignored because he lied. He wasn't dismissed because he exaggerated. He wasn't sidelined because he contradicted other medical personnel. He was ignored because he didn't contradict them. His memories matched too many professionals from the night of the autopsy, people the official narrative had slowly filtered out. His silence after the hearings wasn't a retreat. It was a continuation of who he'd always been, but the silence around him that was something else. It was the system quietly deciding that his story had served its purpose. It was recorded, archived, and buried under thousands of pages most people would never read. The turning point in Robinson's story doesn't come from emotion or speculation. It comes from something much harder to dismiss: the physical evidence that still survives. When you start lining up Robinson's statements with the autopsy face sheet, the clothing, the x-rays, and the earliest medical testimonies from Parkland, something surprising happens. His descriptions settle right into the centre of it. And that's what makes this part of the story so important. Start with the autopsy face sheet. This document wasn't written by researchers decades later. It was drafted at the autopsy, on the night the body was actually on the table. It marks wound locations the way a map maker marks landmarks. And the first detail that jumps out is the location of the head defect. The face sheet places the major opening toward the lower right rear of the skull, not high on the top, not on the side, but low and behind. That's the same exact spot Robinson described in his testimony, the same spot he reconstructed with wax and plaster, and the same area dozens of witnesses remembered seeing. Then look at the clothing. Kennedy's shirt and jacket both show a small, clean tear, low on the back, far lower than the high shoulder description presented in later reports. That low placement matches what Robinson pointed out. The wound wasn't near the neck, and it wasn't positioned at an angle that fits a downward trajectory from the Texas schoolbook depository. Instead, the clothing suggests a wound much lower, near the area marked on the face sheet, and consistent with a shot entering from the front or level position rather than a steep angle from behind. The x-rays add another layer. They show fractures radiating across the skull in patterns that match the earlier descriptions of a rear blowout. The rear skull bone appears disrupted or missing, which supports what both Robinson and several autopsy participants described that night. Even the Parkland doctors, the first people to treat Kennedy, talked about a large defect in the back of the head. All these pieces fit together in a way that strengthens Robinson's credibility. The lower back wound is one of the clearest examples. For years, debates around the JFK case tangled around its height on the body, but the clothing tells a straightforward story. The holes in the shirt and jacket sit lower than the revised autopsy placement. They point to a location that matches Robinson's description and the face sheet sketch. The significance is simple. A wound that low doesn't support a steep, downward shot from above and behind. It suggests a flatter trajectory or a shot entering from the front. Robinson didn't claim to analyse angles that night, but he did say one thing with certainty. He saw the entry in a low position and treated it accordingly. That lines up with the hard evidence. Then there's the forehead entry point he described. This detail often gets overlooked, yet it matches observations from others at the autopsy, who mentioned a small puncture wound near the hairline. It also lines up with comments made by some Parkland doctors who noted a small wound they initially interpreted as an entry. The key here is that Robinson never tried to create a theory around these wounds. He wasn't building a case, and he wasn't trying to solve the assassination. He wasn't thinking in terms of snipers, or angles, or shots fired. This is where Robinson's absence from the Warren Commission becomes even more meaningful. His testimony would have forced them to confront the physical details they were trying to reinterpret, through diagrams rather than photographs. His presence would have introduced contradictions the Commission wasn't prepared to resolve. By excluding him, the case stayed simple. And simplicity was necessary because Oswald never lived to testify, never faced trial, and never provided the cross-examination that normally shapes a murder case. The story had to be clean. Robinson made it messy just by telling the truth. When historians talk about the greater mystery of the Kennedy assassination, they often focus on conspiracies, motives, and political tensions. But Robinson's testimony pushes the mystery in a different direction. It shows how the shape of a national narrative can be built, not only by what's included, but by what's left out. That mismatch is what changes the timeline today. If Robinson's descriptions are accurate, then the core assumptions behind the Warren Commission are unstable. If the core assumptions are unstable, the conclusions they rest on become vulnerable. And once those conclusions wobble, the entire narrative of a lone gunman becomes a possibility rather than a certainty. And that brings us to the real weight of Robinson's story. He didn't overturn the official narrative. He didn't expose a plot. He didn't point to hidden documents or secret shooters. What he did was something much harder to explain away. He revealed contradictions, small, simple contradictions in wound placement that ripple outward into the very structure of the case. A contradiction isn't a theory. It doesn't need evidence beyond itself. It doesn't fade with time. It stays, waiting for someone to confront it. Robinson showed that the truth doesn't need to be loud to be disruptive. It can whisper and still shake the foundation. He didn't carry a conspiracy on his shoulders. He carried a memory. And that memory didn't match the diagrams that shaped the national story.